Welcome back to the channel. I am attira.kell and this is A Soldier's Opinion, the series where I apply my 19 years of experience in the military to the various mechanics of Star Citizen. I try to talk about where we are today and where I think we should be headed in Star Citizen, specifically so that we can achieve a more realistic series of mechanics for the combat professions within reason. This is a game after all. Today we are talking about logistics, a topic I am loath to cover, mainly because the reality of logistics is both complex and, let's be honest, can be a little boring. While more to the point, the planning of logistics is complex and boring. The execution of logistics can be anything from a milk run to an absolutely terrifying shit show and everything in between. So it's definitely got that going for it. But before we get started, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I am trying to grow the channel, but more to the point, the more people that see these videos, the better chance we might have to influence CIG to take some of these ideas and implement them into the game. Now, this video is contingent on one critical assumption and one caveat that I would like to state openly before we get going. We know CIG is planning medical care, rearm, refuel, and repair mechanics. They have talked about component replacement as well. And I think we're pretty close to a lot of that. What they have not addressed is how we will resupply food, water, air, and FPS ammunition and equipment in a way that can be consumed by either the client ship or its crew. So I am assuming that CIG will address that at some point in the future, and my hope is to influence that a bit. The caveat is this: logistics as I am describing it seems somewhat overwhelming. It has a lot of moving pieces, and a lot of small orgs, my own included, may never need the multi-echelon structure that we will discuss. But all organizations should take these concepts, if not the scale, and apply them when taking on a combat mission. Understanding where to go for resupply is critical to every pilot, be they alone or with a team. Planning just a single resupply point for a small org deep in space between planets may provide a huge advantage in a fight. So I encourage all organizations, not only the medium or large ones, to think about how you might use these principles to make your combat forces more formidable. Much of this video is about how we as players should think about planning logistics. We can only hope that CIG helps us with providing the tools to bring even more depth to logistics gameplay than what they already have planned. Now, with that out of the way, let's quickly highlight every ship in the current lineup that might have a logistical role, and then we'll get into how we can think about logistics for organizations at war. I am pretty sure I got them all, and of course CIG is going to add to this list over time. And remember, logistics for modern militaries covers a whole bevy of tasks, not just moving cargo. So bulk cargo, repair, refuel, medical, and vehicle recovery might all fall under or be paired with a logistics element of your organization. So, in the skies we have the Avenger Titan and Renegade variant, which are light freight. We have the Anvil Valkyrie, which is a tactical resupply ship. The Anvil Vulcan, medium repair and refuel. We have the Crucible, which is our heavy repair endgame capability. We have the C8 Pisces, which might be tactical resupply. And we have the Carrack, which is both an exploration, but also has a massive freight capability, which puts it in a heavy freight category. We have the Argo MPOV personnel, which of course we can't forget that personnel are going to have to be resupplied at times. We have the MPOV cargo, light freight, and we have the SRV recovery vehicle, which kind of acts as our M88 recovery vehicle. We have the ever elusive Banu merchantman, which clearly falls into the category of heavy freight. We have the Mustang Alpha and the Vindicator model, which fall in line with light freight starter ships, and the Nomad, which is a light freight and might also be considered a tactical resupply capability. And then we have the Pioneer, which is a general engineering ship, and we'll talk about that more later. We have the Crusader lineup, the Mercury Star Runner, which is a medium freight vessel, and we have the Genesis Star Liner, which is a heavy freight ship, but also comes with that large bulk personnel transport capability. We also have the C2 and the M2, and to a lesser extent, the A2 due to its large bombs, but all three of these fall into the heavy freight category. Next we have the Cutlass Black, which is a medium freight capability, along with the Corsair, which is a slightly larger medium freight ship, and the Caterpillar, which is a heavy freight ship with some planned modularity in the future that might allow it to take on a variety of logistics roles. Next we have the Cutlass Red, which is our tactical medevac capability. Moving on to the MISC lineup, we have the Reliant Core for light freight, the Hull A and B for medium freight, the Hull C, D, and E for heavy freight, the Freelancer, which is a medium freight vessel, and the Freelancer Max, which is a better medium freight vessel, the Starfarer and the Starfarer Jomini, which are both heavy freight and heavy refueling, and the Endeavor, which I would classify as maybe a theater medical treatment facility, a hospital in the sky. We have the 135C light freight starter from Origin and the Aurora CL light freight starter from RSI. We have the Constellation Taurus, which is a better medium freight option, and then we have the entire Constellation line to a lesser extent, which is also medium freight options. And finally, we have the Apollo Medevac and the Apollo Triage, both operational level medical ships with potential for tactical action. Now, on the ground, we have the Drake Dragonfly, the Tumbril Ranger CV, the Cyclone base variant, and the Ursa Rover, which definitely has cargo. You just have to flip up the seats in the back, and underneath those you'll see the cargo pads for magnetically attaching cargo. Okay. Now clearly you can see that I have included every ship that might serve in this career field. We can all see that a starter ship might not be the best option for bulk logistics delivery, but all players, regardless of the ship that they fly, can and should participate in logistics gameplay. So there you have it. Now that that is said, let us quickly discuss logistical models. A quick note here. This video focuses a lot on how you as a military-focused gamer should think about logistics and plan logistics in this complex space sim we all love. There are some things I think CIG needs to give us with regard to mechanics, but a lot of this is how we use the ships we have and how we see and plan for our operational environment. So with that said, there are two core models that the military uses at present to manage its supply chains, and we use both simultaneously. It is important to note that for some categories of supply, the first model is good, and for others, the second model is more appropriate. The first is the hierarchical supply model. This model is our fundamental methodology for resupplying our forces. In this model, supplies start at the manufacturer and make their way through the Army supply network until they arrive to what we have recently redesignated the highest echelon of tactical command, the Corps. From the Corps support area, these supplies will make their way through the division, brigade, and battalion sustainment areas before being disseminated to the company, platoon, and individual levels. All classes of supply can transit this arduous process. It allows for an organized dissemination of supply according to the need as determined by the requests for supply from below, and the logistical need as determined by the planners at each echelon. The second model is the direct-to-customer model. This model can be adopted at any echelon to move supplies more quickly to the combat force in need. With this model, we see a supply shipment skip one or more echelons being delivered directly to the unit in need. I experienced an excellent example of this in 2003 in Iraq. While attached to the 101st Airborne Division, the tank battalion of which I was assigned ran into many parts resupply challenges. In one particular case, I remember the battalion maintenance folks needed a replacement engine for a deadline tank. Replacement engines are not what you would call common by any means. Luckily, we had a friend in Petraeus, who ordered the Combat Aviation Brigade to move an engine from who the hell knows where directly to the battalion's maintenance area. And this was not an uncommon practice. Our mechanics were lucky enough to have many a direct resupply of parts courtesy of the 101st Cab. Certainly we did not get all of our resupply in this fashion, but we did get critical items that would otherwise have taken much longer to move through the hierarchical chain, all of this in order to keep our units at the highest levels of combat power. Okay, with those models in mind, let's move on to discuss theory. This will help us understand how we should think about complex logistics, and then we'll talk about principles and elements of modern logistics in the military and a way that you can structure your planning efforts. So, to provide the theory, we are going to dig into the favored texts of all Western military officers, On War by Karl von Clausewitz and The Art of War by Antony Jomini. Literally every single Command and General Staff College grad on Earth just groaned audibly. You're welcome. Now, a bit of context before we get going. These two military strategists are universally famous within military circles for the two books I just mentioned. Early on, Jomini considered Clausewitz to be competition, but later realized that in fact the two works are more or less complementary, but not competitive. Clausewitz focuses more on the big picture, the theory surrounding war and how it is fought and how it ties with the broader political and diplomatic issues surrounding war. Jomini is more detailed on the execution of certain principles, and gives examples where those principles were executed with success. As we set off on this adventure, let's begin with Clausewitz. He argues that there are 4 primary means to supply military force while on campaign. The first is living off local households or the community, which amounts to about the same thing. Clausewitz assessed that a town can furnish food and lodgings for a day for about as many soldiers as there are inhabitants without any special preparations. The second is supply by requisition, carried out by the troops themselves. This is not very different from the first means, excepting that larger units will draw from multiple villages in the area and centralize the supplies for distribution to the army. Number 3 is regular requisition. This is Clausewitz's most preferred form of supplying a large force. The main difference is that local authorities are involved. Instead of direct seizure of needed supplies wherever they are found, they are organized and delivered by the locals in an orderly way, and the locals are paid for the supplies. In this method, threat of force is always present. However, purchase of supplies is also an option if funds are available. The fourth means of supplying an army is sustenance by means of depot. Perhaps Clausewitz's least favorite form of supplying an army, he asked the question, will such a system ever be used again? This has of course become very common in modern times. He goes on to say, admittedly, any other kind is hard to imagine with the type of warfare in which large armies stayed in the same place for 7, 10, or 12 years. Which is of course exactly what the US and coalition forces have done in both Iraq and Afghanistan. It might also be argued that today the first 2 systems are largely considered to be immoral to one degree or another. The second 2 being reasonably acceptable options, as you are either very clearly paying for the supplies needed, and the fourth is more of a method to store supplies purchased versus a means of acquiring supply. Moving on to Jomini. He doesn't provide an analysis of the means of supply so much as he provides general maxims of how to conduct depot operations. You'll note as a trend as we go forward that Clausewitz provides theory much of the time, while Jomini provides more of a how-to, more or less. Jomini's first maxim is that if a large force is in a fertile area, at great distance from a hostile force, then they should be able to safely recover a considerable extent of the country and may draw its resources from it. The second is that during this period, when the enemy is distant, supplies should be gathered from the surrounding countryside and depots formed, in order to subserve the wants of the army. So we can see here that Jomini seems to disagree with Clausewitz on the best way to sustain a military force. The third maxim I will give to you in full as Jomini says it best. The depots formed either by purchase or forced requisition should be echeloned as much as possible upon 3 different lines of communication in order to supply with more facility the wings of the army, and to extend as much as possible the area from which successive supplies are to be drawn. And lastly, in order that the depots should be as well covered as possible. In this maxim, Jomini is addressing several principles of logistics: dispersion, security, supply routes, and market for supplies. There's definitely a lot going on in the third maxim. The fourth maxim states that in thinly settled and unproductive regions, it will be prudent for an army, in this case, not to advance too far from its depots and to carry with it sufficient provisions. In other words, combat forces may be forced to carry a significant amount of their own supplies if they are moving into an uninhabited or uninhabitable area. This includes all classes of supplies for warfighting, but we'll touch on classes of supply a little later. The fifth maxim builds on the fourth. Jomini tells us that if a force is attacking a nation state, and that state decides to withdraw and burn everything behind it, such as Russia has done many times, most famously against Napoleon, then the military force again must carry all supplies needed in their trains. As a quick note, the term supply trains, or trains of provisions, as Jomini calls them, are simply military jargon for supply convoys or depots. The sixth maxim states that it is not only necessary to collect large quantities of supply, but a military force must have the means to transport it. In this maxim, he also states that rations should be the lightest weight and durable so as to pass over all types of roads. He also states here, lastly, the soldiers must be habituated to carry with them several days of rations of bread, rice, or even flour. In 2003, we carried 7 days of food and water on board our tanks, and I don't think we ever dropped below a 4-day supply. This of course gave us the ability to separate from the company and battalion for a few days at a time, as long as we could find a source of fuel and or had a fueler assigned to us. This allowed the company and battalion significant independence to support other units with a platoon of tanks at need. Moving on to our 7th maxim, the vicinity of the sea is invaluable for transportation of supplies, and the party which is master of this element can supply himself at will. I think we can all see here the corollary of the sea and space for our purposes in Star Citizen. Control of space and the ability to move supplies through space to a planet will be fundamental gameplay for military campaigns. The 8th maxim states that a continental army using the sea for transportation should base itself on the land and establish a reserve of provisions independent of its ships. In other words, don't keep all your eggs in one basket. If you intend on only resupplying your fleets or armies in Star Citizen from space, think about adding a ground-based depot somewhere in the system as a reserve. The 9th deals with the use of rivers and canals for more rapid movement of supplies and the benefits and challenges of doing this. I am not 100% confident this is applicable to Star Citizen, however, for the purpose of the complete list of maxims, I have included it. The final maxim states that if bread or biscuit is not available or in limited supply to feed the military force, you can resort to what Jomini calls cattle on the hoof, meaning local cattle livestock. He stresses that this must be strictly controlled as this resource can be quickly expended. This of course falls more in line with Clausewitz's first 3 methods of supply with regard to either living off the land or requisitioning supplies local to the force. The next fundamental aspect of logistics that we need to discuss is lines of communication, or LOCs. We mentioned this a bit earlier, but now we'll dig into what these are. Clausewitz addresses these, but as we'll see in a moment, Jomini spends much more time defining the multiple types of LOCs and their use. But for a moment, let's see what Clausewitz has to say on the issue. He stated that roads that lead from an army's position back to the main source of food and replacements, and that are apt to be the ones the army chooses in the event of a retreat, have 2 purposes. Those 2 purposes are to serve as lines of communication and a line of retreat. Clausewitz considers these to be the arteries of any army and stresses that at no time should they be cut by an opposing force. Most often these are roads, but they don't have to be. He assesses that the length, number, orientation, state, and cover of LOCs in a given region determine their value. Moreover, Clausewitz states that the longer an LOC, the more challenging it is to maintain. This is because, in general, a long LOC requires a certain waste of strength, which tends to cripple the condition of the army. In other words, a military force must secure its LOC if it is to continue to receive needed supplies, and as such must use soldiers to secure it. Those soldiers might otherwise be involved in the main fighting, and thus is costing the military force strength of numbers at the decisive point of the engagement. The other key use of these roads is as a line of retreat. In this role, lines of communication, nay, lines of retreat, become an integral part of a military force's strategic rear. The same criteria for evaluation of value is used here, as well as used to judge how difficult a withdrawal or retreat will be on the military force. Some final points on Clausewitz on the issue of LOCs are these. Even in its own territory, a military force has lines of communication. These of course do not need to be secured by the army, as they are in territory which is generally friendly to the force, but planning and maintaining these is important to any force in its own territory. As a force moves into a hostile area, they should be careful of the burden they place on the local population. Only establish garrisons where required to secure an LOC. If there are multiple roads moving in the same direction, it is only required to place garrisons along the road being used by the military force. Clausewitz states, if on the other hand, commissaries, commandants, police, security posts, and administrative personnel were to be dispatched along some distant road not used by the army, the local inhabitants would regard this as an unnecessary burden. Additionally, he stated that LOCs are better when they connect large centers of commerce and are wide, allowing for significant traffic. This is of course assuming the military force is using the roads. I only state this because though we do use roads today, it is not technically a requirement. In the Persian Gulf War, the US attacked through the desert, thus requiring its LOCs to run through the desert. Roads of course were used when present, but when not, GPS allowed them to navigate through the deserts. Given our ability to navigate in Star Citizen, I expect the same will be true as well. Let's now turn to Jomini's The Art of War. In this text, he primarily focuses on lines of operation, but to understand this, we must also understand the term in a larger context. Jomini tells us that the term zone of operation is applied to a large fraction of the general theater of war. The term lines of operation will designate the part of this fraction embraced by the enterprise of the Army. Lines of communication designate the practicable route between the different portions of the Army occupying different positions throughout the zone of operation. Now, Jomini specifically states that he differs with other contemporary writers and that he believes that a military force will still have lines of operation even if they are sitting on top of their depot. Bottom line, a line of operation serves as a line of communication, but may also be strictly for the maneuver of a military force. However, for our purposes here, we can make the correlation that in most cases, a line of communication will also function along the same route as a line of operation. Going forward, I will refer specifically to lines of operation to remain factually consistent with Jomini. However, I would ask you to tool your thought process towards how you might use these lines of operations for logistics. Alright, with that said, Jomini breaks down lines of operation, or LOOs, into 10 separate subcategories. Where Clausewitz gives us the overarching concept of LOCs, Jomini provides us with an almost staff-level analysis. The first are simple lines of operation. This applies when a single force is operating along a single front or frontier. The second are double lines of operation. This is much as it sounds and applies when two large forces roughly equal in size are operating along the same front, or if two armies commanded by the same commander are separated in distance for long periods of time. Jomini offers a long caveat to this, but I'm not convinced we need to discuss it here. The third are interior lines of operation. These are those adopted by one or two armies to oppose several hostile forces, providing the ability to concentrate the whole force before the enemy can oppose them with a greater force. Within the realm of logistics, these lines of operation might be used to resupply your own force before an enemy can theirs. Depending on how long an engagement is drawing out, the ability to cross-level supplies from one force to another might prove key. The fourth are exterior lines of operation. As you can imagine, these operate in the reverse of interior lines. These are the lines of operations you would need if you were operating on two flanks of an enemy force. As it is unlikely you can move logistics through the enemy lines, you would have to take a wide path around the enemy force to either reinforce a flank, resupply, or cross-level supplies from one army to the other. The fifth type is concentric lines of operation. In this case, these chart a path from many widely separated points to meet at a single point. Imagine you have several small logistical nodes seeded throughout a system, all of which supply a single primary force. The loss of one of these would likely not prove detrimental to the entire operation. The sixth is divergent lines of operation. These, of course, achieve the opposite of the concentric lines. Imagine a single depot, and from this position, you resupply several forces in the field. This, of course, provides the enemy with a juicy, high-value target to go after if they can find it, but depending on the circumstances, this may be an acceptable risk. The seventh line of operation is the secondary line of operation. This is used when you have two forces, one of which is designated as primary and the other as a secondary or supporting force. This seems very much like the double lines of operation, however, there is some subtle difference. With the double lines of operation, there is no requirement for the two armies to be supporting each other. They may have completely separate objectives. However, with the secondary line of operation, the secondary force is in support to the primary force. Both have the same core objective. In terms of logistics, we have secondary lines of operation all the time. These are alternate routes to arrive at the same location. If one of the routes gets cut off, then you immediately shift to the secondary route. The eighth is the accidental line of operation. These are brought about by events which change the original plan and give a new direction to operations. These are of the highest importance. The proper occasions for their use are fully recognized only by a great and active mind. In the simplest of terms, these are lines of operation that develop organically during battle. They might be used as a logistical resupply line, or they may serve as a means to take the enemy off guard and destroy them outright. Now let us quickly talk about two lines of operation that are primarily used by planners. The 9th and 10th are provisional and definitive lines of operation. Jomini states that the first of these is the initial line of operation selected at the start of an operation. The second, definitive line of operation, though not specifically defined, must then be the line of operation ultimately selected by the Army to maneuver on. But more or less, Jomini assesses both of these to be temporary or eventual strategic lines. This translates to mean that these are lines of operation that planners will lay on a map during the planning process, but may or may not be used based on how the battle begins or proceeds. So, now we have covered Jomini's thoughts on lines of operation. You can certainly see how all of these can be used for planning combat operations, but as I stated, in most cases, the lines on the ground, or in our case space, that the military forces follow are most often where the logistical trains will also flow. And now we have a collective vocabulary to use for planning and execution. Now, there's a lot more discussed within the realm of lines of operation, but much of it exists beyond the scope of this particular video. Certainly Jomini has many thoughts on how these lines should be used by maneuver forces, and there is also much thought on how to secure them. Here we shall pause and briefly discuss two primary means. Clausewitz states that a reserve has two distinct purposes. One is to prolong and renew the action, the second to counter unforeseen threats. Jomini provides us with a slightly different definition. He states that there are in fact two types of reserve, the first with the mission similar to Clausewitz's, and the second which focuses on recruitment. But of critical importance to our discussion here, Jomini states that these reserves ought to hold the most important points between the base and the front of operations, occupy the fortified places if any have been reduced, observe or invest those which are held by the enemy, and if there are no fortresses as a point of support, they should throw up entrenched camps or têtes de ponts to protect the depots and to increase the strength of their positions. All that to say that a great use for your reserve force when not in use, shoring up a weakness in your plan, or exploiting a failure of the enemy, is guarding your supply points. Finally, to wrap up the historical and conceptual part of this video, let's address Jomini's Chapter 7, Logistics or the Practical Art of Moving Armies. This is a very interesting chapter because Jomini effectively lumps many non-logistical tasks by today's standards into logistics. And so to help differentiate a bit, I've pulled out the salient points as they pertain to logistics as we know it today. He begins with a paragraph of questions. Is logistics simply a science of detail? Or on the contrary, is it a general science, forming one of the most essential parts of the art of war? Or is it but a term, consecrated by long use, intended to designate collectively the different branches of staff duty? That is to say, the different means of carrying out in practice the theoretical combinations of the art. He does expound upon these questions to give his own position on the issue, but I leave you to explore this for yourself. For now, let us content ourselves with discussing the primary duties and missions of the logistician. Firstly, he states that a logistician is responsible for preparation of all material necessary for setting the army in motion, or in other words, for opening the campaign. He expands this a bit to make it more of a chief of staff duty, but with just this sentence we can see that a senior logistician may take on this responsibility. The second duty addresses security, stating arranging with the chiefs of engineers and artillery the measures to be taken for the security of the posts that are to be used as depots. The next is to keep the various elements of the military informed about what support they may hope to receive in case of need. And so here we see a reporting requirement for the logistics officer to provide to senior leaders. The fourth is a big one, arranging and superintending the march of trains of baggage, munitions, provisions, and ambulances, both with columns and in their rear, in such a manner that they will not interfere with the movements of the troops. but remain near at hand. The fifth is somewhat an extension of the fourth, in that the logistics officer must plan for follow-on shipments of supplies, and where possible collect up as many means of supply, i.e. ships, in the area of operation to best supply the military force. The sixth is the organizing of depots for convalescent, wounded, and sickly men, movable hospitals, and workshops for repairs, and providing for their safety. And finally, if you read on a few pages, you will find guidance on extending lines of communication, in which secondary depots must have adequate separation, but must not be too close together, and usually near or in settled areas, though I don't know if Star Citizen will allow us to place player structures so close to NPC towns. Okay, alright, we are through with the old guidebooks. Let's talk about how we do it today, specifically where all of these sustainment operations occur. Within our Army doctrine, which is typically the foundation for joint doctrine, we divide the area of operations into 4 areas. Each of these can be applied to every echelon of command and help the commander and staff to frame their area of operation. As a note, yes, modern doctrine with regard to logistics footprint is 2D, two-dimensional, just like it would be on a planet in Star Citizen. In space, obviously, we should try to apply this in a 3-dimensional context to make the best use of space available. As another quick note, I'm going to use Army terms for different echelons of command, but all you need to understand really is that these represent levels of command within a large military force. Whatever you decide to call your echelons, those can be directly applied to this construct if you like. The first is the deep area. This is generally where an opponent is maintaining their larger logistical nodes to support their combat forces, as well as where most of their senior command and control elements are located. Those leaders receive reports from the front lines and make decisions based on those reports received from across their forces, generally in conjunction with a map called a common operating picture. This is the area where you as a commander might seek to disrupt enemy operations with deep strikes designed to eliminate their command and control nodes or logistical points. The next area is the close area. This is where the heavy fighting is taking place. It is important to note that a division close area might contain brigade and battalion level logistics elements. This is because, of course, every echelon typically has its own organic sustainment capabilities, though tailored for their specific needs. I will point out here that each area will overlap with higher echelons areas. By this I mean a battalion's deep close and support area will likely all exist within the division's close area. This because the division's area of operation is so much larger than that of a battalion. The next is the consolidation area. This is one of those new sort of fluid spaces we have recently added to our doctrine. In this area, a combat force is seeking to consolidate their offensive gains. This is typically run by a separate maneuver force from those in the close area. That force will typically employ a combination of offensive, defensive, and stability tasks to achieve continued operational success for the division, while the enemy force will continue to fight to destabilize that area if possible. Our final area is the support area. The support area is normally, but not always, positioned within and surrounded by the consolidation area. It is here where most of an echelon's sustainment operations, such as repair, refueling, and rearming, occur. The size of this area varies greatly based on the echelon, mission, and the space available. As we discussed a moment ago, a brigade or battalion support area may very well be inside the division's close area. This must happen for a battalion's sustainment capabilities to support them. However, during the fight, these support forces move back and forth between multiple echelons of support areas to acquire new supplies and bring forward those supplies to the close area to support those combat forces. As a note for all you would-be commanders out there, remember it is important to provide your sustainment capabilities with security. For the American Army, we have Maneuver Enhancement Brigades, or MEBs, that are typically assigned with this task. Now, in Star Citizen, as in real life, our logistical vehicles are not without teeth, but they are not designed to hold out very long against dedicated combat capabilities. So designating a small force to protect your support area is always a smart move. Now that we have talked about how the battlefield is divided in a modern context, remembering that this is only a framework and can be reshaped for a 3-dimensional space, let's talk about our modern principles of logistics. The first principle is integration. Basically, the principles state that if you are planning an operation, Simultaneously, and as an integrated process, you should be planning how you will sustain and supply that operation. So often we just like to dump this on our logistics officers and say, figure it out. But this principle tells us that the operations officer or planner should be tied at the hip with the logistician in the same way that they should be with the intelligence officer to ensure that the plan of attack or defense has a logistics effort that is thoughtfully built to support it. The next is anticipation. This is the ability to forecast operational requirements and integrate necessary actions that most appropriately satisfy a response without waiting for an order. Doctrine states that this is shaped by our best judgment, which results from experience, training, education, intelligence, and intuition. I can tell you that anticipating fuel and ammunition consumption and planning for that resupply is a key part of any logistician's day when their unit is on the attack, or being attacked, or if they are simply conducting routine operations. Number 3 is responsiveness, which is of course the ability to react to changing requirements and respond quickly, providing resources to the right place at the right time. Number 4 is simplicity. Now within doctrine, this is talking about clarity of tasks, standardized procedures, and clearly defined command relationships, which is my favorite. But there are other aspects of this too. For instance, for decades, NATO has standardized munitions for small arms, 9mm for sidearm, 5.56mm for the standard rifle, and 7.62mm for all light machine guns, meaning that anyone in NATO can receive small arms from anyone else. This directly translates to Star Citizen in that whatever SIG comes up with for small arms resupply in the PU, large organizations are going to want to standardize their weapons so that it is easier to resupply soldiers on the ground or fighters in space, or simply use energy-based weapons and remove the sustainment requirement altogether for that type of weapon. Numbers 5 and 6 are economy and survivability. Economy tells us to maintain discipline of supply, follow prioritizations of supply, and correctly allocate resources. It also tells us to remove duplication of effort. Survivability is self-evident, the protection of personnel, weapons, and supplies, all while deceiving the enemy with regard to your location. However, I will point out that with regard to supply points, some duplication is good. Following a not all eggs in one basket policy, or at a minimum a decentralized sustainment footprint, can provide an advantage. If your opponent is doing their job right, they should be looking for your resupply capabilities to destroy them, thereby limiting how long you can stay in the fight. A decentralized scheme of maneuver provides a more complex but more survivable logistics footprint. Principle 7 is continuity. This speaks to a strategic or tactical system of continuous supply, preventing significant shortfalls for any extended period of time and creating confidence in both commander and troops that they have a solid supply chain to support operations. And finally, Principle 8 is improvisation. This speaks directly to Jomini's 8th line of communication or line of operation, the accidental LOC or LU. Your logistician should be tracking the battle as closely as the rest of the staff to take advantage of those unexpected situations that always arise. Okay, so those are our modern principles of logistics. Now we're going to talk about logistics elements, but we are also going to integrate what we know about Star Citizen's current ship and vehicle lineup. And we'll throw in some theory crafting to discuss where I think CIG can give us improved mechanics to deepen logistics gameplay. As a quick note, as we jump into this, I'm only discussing one or two options for these elements, not giving the definitive answer to the test. So leave in the comments your thoughts on how to achieve a good sustainment plan. There are always more than one way to skin a cat. With that said, let's talk about our first logistical element, which is maintenance. Now, the U.S. Army breaks maintenance into two subcategories: field maintenance and sustainment maintenance. Field maintenance is typically conducted as close to the battle as is practical by the soldier, in our case, the spaceman. This typically covers component replacement, which perfectly aligns with Star Citizen, as well as battle damage assessment, repair, and recovery of damaged equipment. So, in Star Citizen, what would this look like? Well, in space, recovery might be conducted by an SRV. While the crew is doing as many repairs as possible with the repair multi-tool or other specialized equipment, the SRV might move the damaged ship to the rear of the fight, where a Vulcan might conduct a more thorough repair before sending the ship back into the fight. On the ground, well, we really don't have an on-ground repair vehicle or a means to tow a disabled vehicle. So for ground maintenance, we must rely upon the crew to repair their vehicle with the multi-tool. This is where I think we could use a new ground vehicle. For those of you who played MechWarrior 3, I love that game, there were these 3 vehicles that would follow you around and could affect both repair and rearm. We could use something like this, a vehicle that can both recover a damaged combat vehicle and also repair it. I would point CIG to the M88 recovery vehicle for inspiration. This beast is a welcome sight to any and all vehicle crewmen who are stuck or broke down or in need of any repair. But what would such a vehicle, either in space or on the ground, need for this task? Well, I think they need room to store 1 or 2 small size 0 or size 1 replacement power plants, a couple of extra coolers, and some additional shield generators. There should be room for extra repair multi-tools or specialty tools for ship and vehicle repair. A small tractor beam to help flip over vehicles that have flipped would not go amiss as well, as this is a common problem in Star Citizen. I think you get the idea here. Next, let's talk about sustainment maintenance. Now, in our doctrine, this is a national level maintenance provider, which typically means those dirty contractors. Kidding, but not really, but kidding. As a quote from FM 4.0 tells us, sustainment maintenance is performed by DoD civilians and contractors who return equipment to a national standard, after which the equipment is placed back into the overall supply system. So what are we talking about here in Star Citizen? Well, we're talking about the Crucible, the end-game maintenance ship currently planned, but not in the game yet. We can also place into this category any NPC space stations that can offer repair as a service. In practical terms, we're talking about repairs that require significant resources and might take time. Now, in Star Citizen, we know that currently repairs are pretty quick, and I don't really expect that to change. It is a game after all, but we can expect that the Crucible and the Vulcan will require materials to effect repairs. So again, we'll need storage space for various components and likely additional material on hand for hull repairs. In terms of an organization's offensive campaign, we should plan on having a rear area logistical node for repairs both in space and on a suitable planet if one is available. We should integrate local NPC ground and space stations into our plan as well if they are available. For us, in Star Citizen, we should think of sustainment maintenance as the operational level as opposed to the tactical level. I think that given this is a game, we probably will not see Aegis out there supporting repair the way we would expect BAE or Northrop Grumman to provide those services to the US military, for an incredible cost, of course. Also, with the existence of insurance, I think many players will simply lay in an insurance claim for a massively damaged ship rather than go through the trouble of managing a complex strategic repair capability. Our next key logistics element is transportation. Transportation units play a key role in facilitating endurance. Transportation units move sustainment from ports through the system to points of employment and retrograde materials as required. The tenets of transportation operations include centralized control and decentralized execution, forward support, and fluid and flexible movements, effective use of assets and carrying capacity, in-transit visibility, regulated movements, and interoperability. This smacks very much of our principles 5 and 6, economy and survivability. We see economy of manpower through the centralized control of the senior logistical staff, but increase survivability through decentralizing the various supply nodes throughout our operational environment. This also very much touches on our key assumptions from the start of this video. Transportation is meaningless in Star Citizen if, at the destination point, we cannot access and use the supplies brought to us. Now, let's dive a little bit more in depth on transportation. I would not normally say that Doctrine said it best, but in this case, let's use it to describe movement control. Movement control is the dual process of committing allocated transportation assets and regulating movements according to command priorities to synchronize distribution flow over LOCs to sustain land forces. Movement control balances requirements against capabilities and requires continuous synchronization. So the way this plays out is that the logisticians are monitoring all of their LOCs. If one gets jammed up, either through enemy contact or maybe an accident, they will redirect the flow of supplies away from that LOC onto an alternate LOC, all with the intent to bypass the issue and keep the flow of supplies moving. The types of supplies are dictated very often by consumption tables for ammunition, fuel, and food, but also by personal experience, and also where it is needed based on the forward commander's reports. In other words, if you have two objectives, and Objective 1 has no enemy contact and is a cakewalk, but Objective 2 has significant enemy contact, you will prioritize supplies to keep forces on Objective 2 in the fight. The logistics capabilities will push supplies along specific LOCs to support the units in combat, while other LOCs will remain fairly unused or used for a different purpose. Next on our list is Intermodal Operations. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I will say this. This is the process of using multiple modes of transportation, i.e. sea, or in our case space, land, and air. Honestly, for Star Citizen, we don't know enough about how ground combat will play out for this to be super important with regard to land resupply. CIG has certainly made ground turrets more capable, their range has been extended, and those turrets now attack ground vehicles. Let us make another quick assumption that players will be able to place these turrets on their bases. Let's say your organization wants to take that base. If you cannot get a big high signature ship close enough to drop troops or resupply troops on the ground, then you may have to transfer those supplies from a ship to a ground vehicle. This is Intermodal Operations, and as signature management becomes more important, this may become a critical planning factor. Alright, let's move on to our next major element of logistics, supply. Now, I have shown this graphic in previous videos. These are the classes of supply as the Army sees it. You'll note that just about everything you need to live and fight has been categorized. The big five are Class 1, food and water, Class 3, fuel and various fluids required to operate vehicles, Class 5, which is ammunition of all types, Class 8, which is medical supplies, and Class 9, which is repair parts. Now, I encourage all of the logisticians out there to look at all classes of supply, and certainly they all have a place on the battlefield. However, the big five are key once battle has begun, especially if you plan on sustained combat over multiple hours. So, how would we execute this in Star Citizen? We have to be able to reach into large bulk storage boxes and withdraw supplies for use by ships and individuals. We need to be able to move large bulk containers from one ship to another as part of resupply. Luckily, we have the first sign of progress in this area with handheld tractor beams. Now, the handhelds aren't going to help us with huge containers, but we know they're going to have ship-sized tractor beams in the future. It is here that I will drop a plug for a Titan suit-sized tractor beam, a logistics-focused rig designed to operate on stations and ships to move large supply crates. But this still doesn't solve our problem for resupply. For ground combat, I would like to see crates like those found on a Star Marine map. Each one has a specified number of uses for resupply. Crates for food, water, and ammunition at a minimum are critical for that ground gameplay. Oxygen and medical stems would also be good here. I would prefer that each crate be no larger than about 0.5 SCU. This would allow for one crate of ammunition and one crate of food or medical supplies to be transported to troops on the ground in a single Cyclone-sized vehicle. This is also where I can highlight a gap in the vehicle fleet. We need a dedicated cargo truck, preferably capable of carrying around 8 to 10 SCU of cargo. Of course, I want to see it hover, but that's not a real requirement. This would allow bulk resupply of ground forces when the air and space environment is not permissive near an objective. For space, we have an entirely different set of mechanics. As described a while ago, as long as your ship maintains a supply of food and water, the NPCs will eat, drink, and be happy. Quality of victuals will have an impact on troop morale. But for players, it is still unclear how we will access those supplies. Certainly for shipboard marines, crates used for ground combat should be placeable in armories for resupply of FPS ammunition and equipment. But at some point, we as players will need to resupply the ship's stores, and at times this will take place in deep space. I believe it was John Crew himself who said that ship's stores for the crew were not counted in the ship's cargo SCU, which means we will need a mechanic to allow us to transfer food from containers delivered to the ship's supply stores. From there, the crew can access the supplies from requisite areas on the ship. For ship weapons, this might be a transfer mechanic much like components if in the future we have access to the weapons magazines and are allowed to move ammunition from cargo decks to the magazine to reload weapons. The other option is simply to continue on as we are. In this situation, you can expect to need a Vulcan or Crucible to resupply ammunition, and a Vulcan, Starfarer, or Crucible to resupply fuel via drones. Our current question stems from how CIG plan to effect cargo transfer. Do we simply get near to another ship, open a mobi-glass screen, and enact a trade? Or more likely, given CIG's desire to make us work for things, would we have to use tractor beams to move individual crates from one ship to another through space? I think it will be the second, but in either case, this would mean any cargo ship might be able to deliver classes 1, 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. But the time requirements will be substantial and dependent on player and NPC skill level with moving cargo. This, of course, transitions in well with our next element, distribution. This is, of course, the process of delivering all the right things to the right place at the right time to support your organization's operations. And of course, this is the ultimate end goal for the Logistician. Now, there are 3 additional elements we are going to discuss, though we will only cover them briefly. The first is field services. The critical aspects of this for our purposes in Star Citizen are field feeding and water production and distribution. However, this category in real life also covers shower and laundry, aerial delivery of services, and mortuary affairs operations. In other words, the respectful handling of our deceased. Operational contract support is our next element. I will use this to say a.m.m.o, like so many other organizations, is a PMC, or private military company. We do all the things as well, but at our core, we are a PMC. This means, as an example, you might hire us to deliver supplies to your Javelin in preparation for a major attack. The logistics officer would negotiate the rates and arrange for the funds transfer, maybe half before and half after. We, as the contractor, would be responsible for planning and executing delivery of supplies to your ship. We would provide the cargo ship and, depending on how the contract is written, the escort. And of course, all of this would be included in our price. This is the essence of contract support to logistics. You might use a similar PMC organization to attack a target alongside your organization, take on a second target, or just to cover down on a support role. It's all up to you and how you and your organization want to play it. The final element is general engineering support, and this is why at the top of the video I included the Pioneer. The focus of this element is the establishment and maintenance of infrastructure required to conduct and sustain military operations. Of course, this is typically managed by an organization's engineering staff, but it is conceivable that for the purpose of this specific element, you might attach a Pioneer to your logistics section to build a depot, complete with defenses. Alright folks, we are driving towards the end, so let us now turn our attention to a structured method to plan logistics in support of an operation. We are currently engaging in a holistic modernization effort in the U.S. Army to include our logistical capabilities, but what we will discuss here will likely not see significant changes. Our first step in developing our supply chain for operation is to establish the implementation team. This is basically a task organization of your logistical leadership and capabilities. In other words, who will make the decisions for what supplies go where and who is responsible for moving those supplies at different points in the supply chain. For Star Citizen, anyone with good judgment can make a decision, but the who delivers it question will often be tied closely to the ship that person has access to. This of course changes when we can enter our ships into an organizational ship pool and designate people that can draw them out. We will want to use the right ship for the right jobs along the supply chain. We should also really avoid any inadvertent invisible walls or barriers, which might create what we call in the business stovepipes of excellence in our supply chain network. The plan should integrate any outside organizations that you might contract to assist in moving supplies, and they should understand clearly who is going to give them orders during the operation. Step 2 is to develop the supply chain implementation strategy. Now, within the military, this is a fairly comprehensive document. It includes mission, general goals, and objectives, as well as a description of the operational process. It often will cover external factors that may affect the plan and how success will be evaluated. Now, I love a good op ord or plan ord, but I want to be clear. I don't think in Star Citizen, a game, all organizations have to be so document-oriented. However, I think for medium and large organizations trying to establish a new base or engage in a large organizational attack or some other complex activity, there is value in laying out these thoughts on paper. Basically, it gives your team the general direction you want them to go, even if you, the leader, can't be there to lead. And that sometimes can be worth its weight in gold. Step 3 is measure performance. To be honest, for a game, I think we can minimize this. Basically, we're talking about developing a series of metrics that will inform leadership of how well we are meeting the mission, goals, and objectives. These metrics often measure reliability, flexibility, responsiveness, cost, and a host of other variables. If you want to do this, no one is stopping you, of course, but I think as long as you have an after-action review, talk about where you had problems, and try to fix them next time, you'll be fine. Our fourth step is designing your supply chain. This is perhaps the most fun part of organizing sustainment for any organization. In this step, you will design a graphical description of the end-to-end process required to obtain material from initial government or commercial sources and deliver that material or services to the ultimate military consumer. Within this plan, we have two core terms that should be used: processes and functions. Processes are groups of activities that, taken together, result in a fully completed action in support of the customer. Functions are identifiable activities that are grouped together because of common characteristics or interfaces. Processes are made up of functions. So what does that mean for Star Citizen? Well, we go through the process of refueling a ship or rearming a ship, but the amalgamation of all of these processes result in a function of a squadron or battalion resupply point, be it in space or on the ground. Okay, with all that said, let's wrap up. What do I think CIG still needs to give us in the game for logistics to work vaguely like real life, but for a game? For vehicles, first I would like to see a hover ground truck, basically a flatbed with an S1 repeater position on top. For inspiration, look at the old Deuce and a Halfs and 5-ton trucks and how they mount a 50 cal machine gun. Second, I would like to see a Titan suit for moving cargo. Inspiration, Alien 2 Ripley's Power Loader. This would allow for a larger, more powerful intermediate tractor system for moving cargo from one place to another. The Titan suit should also be able to pick up cargo with its arms as an alternative. It should also be able to maneuver in space. Third, any industrial ship focused on resupply or repair at the mid-tier level would be appreciated. For consumables, I think we need a few things. First, we need portable crates of ammunition, food, water, and medical supplies that can be accessed by the player, just like in Star Marine. Each box should have a specific amount of uses, say 30, before it is expended. In fact, anything that CIG thinks the players need for an FPS-like activity should be accessible in this way. We should be able to purchase and load them onto our ships like any other cargo. Once there, alter the permissions so that others may move them and access them. From there, the player logistics team can take over and get the right supplies to the right people. This is separate, I think, from our ability to stock a ship directly from a station or planet with supplies. In this case, we might stock the ship directly from a terminal. The ship then has the crew supplies it needs for operations. Quality affects morale and other stats. Though I do think that the same FPS supply crates might also be drawn upon from a terminal in the ship to resupply the ship. Food, water, ammunition, etc. would then be accessible in the chow hall or armory or wherever that supply would normally be accessed. In this case, the FPS supply crates might be emptied into the ship's inventory and thus the ship resupplied, and the players could dump the empty crates into space, or they could simply vanish. For planet-side depot level activities, we certainly need the Pioneer to enable us to build warehouses as well as landing pads. These pads could then act as a space station or planet-side ports currently do, enabling us to rearm, refuel, or repair, assuming we have the requisite buildings built as a part of that base. From these bases, we might also use our handheld tractor beams to load FPS supply crates to our support ships, like the Valkyrie, or ground vehicle to allow our ground forces to resupply in the fight. Of course, all of this in my mind should be designed to make us, the player, make hard decisions. What type of ammunition will we purchase in bulk? This might determine the weapon type our forces carry so that we have compatible ammunition. Do we spend on high quality food or low and just barely get by? Do we risk resources to build a planet-side depot, or do we keep everything in ships? Are we planning to stay in a particular system or on a planet, or is this a hit-and-run operation? Our ability to build defensive turrets may actually make that decision for us, but I hope we have the option. Whatever CIG ends up doing on the logistics front, it will be up to us, the players, to make the most of it. I hope this video helps you conceptualize how your organization will manage their supplies for combat operations. I think this may be the hardest video yet to research and script out. I hope you enjoyed this content, and if you did, do me a solid, like the video, sub to the channel, and share with your friends. This lets me know that you want me to continue these deep dives into the various military roles of Star Citizen, and hopefully we might just give CIG some ideas to help enrich military gameplay. Until next time, later.